Safe Bank is a custodian bank in the global financial market. One of the services he provides is changing currency for his clients, charging 2 basis points for the service. The bank starts his days with the same amount of each currency by making a settlement at the end of the day with CLS Bank. For this settlement has to pay a fee of 1 point basis of the amount. Safe Bank is obligated to manage risk. If he can support a transaction causes a major disruption on the financial market. To avoid this problem, he can swap currency with his counterparty CLS Bank at any time of the day. For this transaction also has to pay a fee of 50 point basis of the swapped amount. The objective of this simulation is to find the optimal amount of each type of currency to start the day and the optimal amount of currency to swap in order to maximize the profit for Safe Bank, taking into consideration the cost of swapping and settlement, revenue of transactions, and the opportunity cost of carrying unnecessary money. Additionally, we have to determine the optimal point to make a swap. This is because this process takes time, it's not instant. To simulate this situation, several assumptions were made. Even though the bank offers his service 24/7, we assume that works from 8 to 6:30, and at the closing time the settlement occurs. We assume that the exchange rate stays the same over the course of a single day. Actually, this change is insignificantly. On the contrary, we assume that the exchange rate varies over the days. The clients have the same requirements of currency, amount, and type of currency, and make the same number of transactions on each currency, so we didn't include the clients on the model. The 5 days of transactions provided are significantly different, so only one type of day was considered to model the transactions arrivals. What varies is the amount of transactions during a day, so we use small intervals to represent this variation. Intervals of 10 minutes were used with a total of 63 intervals per day. For the simulation, a day has 10.5 hours. This is taken into consideration when we run the model. The opportunity cost is the difference between the level of inventory at the start and at the end of the day, so it's calculated at the start of each day. Therefore, at the start of the first day, there is an opportunity cost because there isn't a final inventory of currency. Since the simulation wasn't run for a whole year, we calculate the opportunity cost as a proportion of the ROI. There are 6 types of entities that represent each kind of transaction made by a client. These transactions arrive on a varying rate mode. In order to do this exchange, an exchange rate is needed, which is assigned at the beginning of every day. The inventory of each type of currency is represented with materials, and these materials are filled and consumed on a workstation, and the amount of the currency out and in. The counterparty global bank is represented by these 3 sources. When an entity is created, there's a probability that this transaction is one of the 6 types. This probability is assigned by a reference property on the table transaction type. The process assigns the amount in of the transaction, the corresponding picture, the type of currency in, the type of currency out, and the amount out, by multiplying the amount with the corresponding exchange rate. Additionally, calculates the revenue from the transaction and the revenue from transaction greater than 100 million or minor than 10 millions, with the purpose of comparing later this data to decide on which transactions the bank should focus. When the bank runs low on a currency, they swap currencies with Global Bank. This process is activated when the monitor event occurs, meaning that the stock of the currency is lower than the ordering point. Safe Bank makes a deal with his counterparty Global Bank to swap the amount fixed previously. Safe Bank has to choose the currency to trade for the swap. We model 2 alternatives. The purpose of this is to determine the more convenient one, resulting in a higher profit. The alternative chosen is defined by the property decide fixed 1 prevailing 2, with the value 1 if the swap is paid with a fixed currency and 2 if it's paid with the prevailing currency. In the first alternative, the currency is determined with properties that can take the value 1 if the currency is paid with dollars, 2 if it's paid with euro, and 3 if it's paid with pounds. The second alternative is to pay for the swap with the prevailing currency. This currency is decreased on the equivalent amount of the swap. This process is triggered at the end of one of the 3 time paths, with a traveling time that connects the sources of the global bank with their sink, to model the time that takes Safe Bank to notice the lack of currency and to make the deal. This process is used to make the model more realistic. To simplify the model, we suppose that the bank receives transactions from 8 to 6:30. If it's past 6, the stock of a currency is lower than the ordering point, and because the time for making the swap with a counterparty takes around 30 minutes, the currency won't be able to arrive before the closing time, incurring on an unnecessary cost since the settlement with CLS Bank is much more convenient than swapping currency. The process is used to model this condition. If the time is between 6 and 6:30, the swap won't occur. In order to save money, this process is assigned on the created entities of the three sources that represent the counterparty global. At the end of each day, a settlement is made. This process is triggered when 10.5 hours have passed, meaning with the time end of the day event. First of all, it assigns the opportunity cost associated with the money in hand. Since the process is triggered at the start of the simulation on time 0, it will only assign the exchange rate for each type of currency because a settlement is not needed. This is by taking a value from the table exchange rate, assign the value for the exchange rate from dollar to euro and dollar to pound, and with these values calculate the cross exchange rates and inverse rate. This way, the exchange rate will keep constant during the day and will change between days in order to make the simulation more realistic, since the exchange rate varies during the year. The aim of the next steps of the process is to reset the amount of currency to their target value. There are 4 scenarios. The first is that all of the currencies are over their initial inventory, so the process only assigns the new initial inventory and assigns the new exchange rate for the following day. The second is that 2 currencies are under their initial inventory target. In this case, both currencies are filled to this target, and the currency that is over its initial inventory is decreased on an equivalent of the increased amount. Finally, calculates the cost of this settlement on USD. The third is that only one currency is lower than its initial inventory. In this case, it decides which currency is the prevailing one, then decides if the amount over the initial inventory of the prevailing currency is enough to pay the lag of the lower currency. If it's true, the lower currency is filled to its initial inventory target and the prevailing one is decreased on the equivalent amount. On the other hand, if the prevailing currency is not enough, this currency is decreased on the difference between the stock and the initial inventory of this currency, and the remaining currency is decreased on the amount that the prevailing currency couldn't cover. Then the lower currency is filled into its initial inventory. All of these amounts are on the equivalent currency, adjusted with the corresponding exchange rate. Finally, on both cases, it calculates the cost of the settlement, the new inventory, and finally the new exchange rates for the next day. The last scenario is that all of the currencies are below their initial inventory. In this case, the process follows the same step than the first scenario. This scenario is possible because we are considering an exchange rate that varies over the day. For scenario number 1, the current safe bank situation is addressed. This means a normal day of operation. The aim of this experiment is to obtain an optimal point of reorder, amount to swap, and the initial level of inventory for each type of currency, modeled with properties that maximize the profit. For this case, the euro currency becomes unstable, and therefore some clients will try to get rid of the unstable currency, while others will try to buy it since they predict that it will recover. Therefore, the proportion of the type of transaction changes. We also change the amount of transaction and the arrival rate. These were obtained from the analysis of the EU default data. In this experiment, the presence of the counterparty does not exist. Therefore, SafeBank loses the ability to swap money during the day. He needs to find the level of initial inventory for each type of currency that allows him to fulfill all of his obligations with his clients, avoiding any kind of disruption of the global financial market. For this case, the settlement policy is not mandatory. This implies that SafeBank will keep all of the currency at the end of the day and start the next one with this amount. If it's running low on a currency, it can swap with Global Bank. It's up to the bank to select if there will be a settlement, when it will happen, and which currency and amount will be settled. We created 3 processes to model the new settlement policy, one for each type of currency. Now it's up to us to decide the settlement point and amount. When the monitor of the available quantity of the currency detects that the settlement point is crossed positively, this process is triggered. In this case, the bank has an excess of this currency, so he will give this excess to CLS Bank and he will return it in one of the remaining currencies, whichever has the lower stock. For the business as usual scenario, inventory starts in $100 billion of each type of currency. If at any time of the day any of the inventories fall to $1 billion, has to request $10 billion to Global Bank. With these parameters, Safe Bank has a profit of almost $1.3 billion for a period of 10 days. Under the EU default scenario, we establish an initial inventory for the dollar of $305 billion, for the euro of $150 billion, and for the pound of $85 billion. When the dollar inventory drops to $100 billion, euros to $70 billion, and pounds to $55 billion, the swap will occur. For this experiment, the profit is maximized to an amount up to $1.27 billion of a period of 10 days. On the other hand, in the situation where the counterparty with Global Bank is lost, we establish all the inventory for its currency in $100 billion, maximizing the profit to an amount of $1.3 billion, also on a period of 10 days. Finally, considering that the inventory is not reset at the end of the day, an initial inventory of $100 billion, €80 billion, and £80 billion is established. Safe Bank will swap with Global Bank, maximizing profits for $1.35 billion on a period of 30 days. When Safe Bank is running low on a currency and has to swap with Global Bank, it's more convenient to trade this currency for the currency that has a prevailing stock. This policy reduces the cost compared with a fixed-rated policy. We were also interested in deciding which expert suggestion you should follow regarding the size of transaction that you should focus on. After several experiments and scenarios, we concluded that you also should focus on the transactions that are under 10 million. That is because the revenue from this kind of transaction is greater than the revenue from transactions of over 100 million. Based on the obtained results, you should adopt a new policy where you don't exchange money with Global Bank. This way, you will maximize the profit. This is because the opportunity cost of having currency in hand is lower than the cost of swapping. Nevertheless, it's important to maintain this alliance, but with a smaller swapping amount, since there's always the risk that a client will make a transaction of a great amount and you won't have the capacity to respond, causing a disruption on the global financial market. By adopting these policies, you will be able to cope with changing market scenarios, ensure the maximization of your profit, and manage the risk.